All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Delta Protection Commission meeting for July 18th, 2019. To start us off, if you would start us off with the pledge, Mrs. Isabel Grassel, if you'd lead us in the pledge. All right, for those who do not know, Isabel, who just led us in the pledge, is a student assistant working for City Council member Bab Sandine, who's sitting in for Mayor Cabalden this evening, and she'll be attending the University of Notre Dame later this summer. So we welcome to the meeting. It's her first Delta Protection Commission meeting. She's very interested in the subject matter, so welcome this evening. Right, go Irish, I heard. All right. So Commission Clerk Ashley Alatorre, would you please call the roll?
I'm going to scoot. Chair Villegas.
Present.
Commissioner Wynn. Here. Commissioner Burgess.
Here.
Commissioner Thompson.
Here.
Commissioner Cott.
Here.
Commissioner Nakanishi. Commissioner Biaggi.
Here.
Commissioner Sandine. Here. Commissioner Slater.
Here.
Commissioner Eddy.
Here.
Okay, you have a quorum.
All right, thank you for that. And as I mentioned earlier, so Commission member Sandine is filling in for Mayor Cabalden. She also, she said, voluntarily agreed to sit at the kids' table this evening because we didn't think we'd have enough chairs, but if you want to move up, you're good? You're comfortable? You like that? Can you, I don't want you there. I don't want you there. All right. And then also Nicole Rinke is our stand-in deputy AG for this evening. So thank you very much for coming this evening. And then also, we also want to congratulate and thank Ashley, our clerk, on her recent marriage, and also the fact that she is going to be leaving us. She's gotten a promotion. So nobody leaves here unless they're getting a promotion. So congratulations for that. So very happy for you. So this is going to be your last meeting. So thank you for your diligent work here on the commission.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, so that takes us to public comment. So this is for items that are not on the agenda but within our subject matter and jurisdiction. And so I only have one slip to speak this evening on items not on the agenda, and that's Deidre Desjardins. I think I got that right, or close.
Thank you. Deirdre Desjardins,
yeah.
with California Water Research. And I saw that you all toured the McDonald Island gas field this afternoon. And there's a very relevant part to the Delta Tunnel project. When there was an independent review of the engineering design in 2010 for what was then the Twin Tunnel project, and one of the things the independent experts were most concerned about was that they were tunneling through gas fields, and they recommended that DWR and MWD locate abandoned gas fields, work with Dogger because Dogger's records weren't well, get permits for any well work that they did, and also, since DWR didn't have any expertise with dealing with abandoning wells, to hire a petroleum expert. And the only reason I found out about this was it was on an internal engineering document, and Google indexed DWR's FTP server. And I got a copy of it, and I read it, and I found out about this independent review. But I don't believe the Delta Protection Commission ever heard about those recommendations. I know that Mark Pruner with the local fire department had never heard about those recommendations. These are the kinds of issues that I think are very important. And I'm going to ask that, one, that there be a second peer review when they get the new design, and two, that it be disclosed to agencies such as yourselves looking for issues like that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Deirdre. Thank you for coming this evening. Okay, that takes care of item 3, and then before we go on to item 4, Erik, did you have something you wanted to change on this evening's agenda? Do you want to make any comments on that?
Yes. Oh, good, it works. Yeah, Mr. Chair, just that item number 10, consider commission comment letter on transfer of Staten Island property. My recommendation would be to defer that item. And I can speak to it a little bit more. I feel it's just not fully ripe for commission discussion and consideration this evening. So that would be my recommendation to you, is to defer item number 10 to a future commission meeting.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for that at this point. So unless there's any questions about that, that'll be the order. We'll defer the item until a future meeting. Right? Okay. Seeing no questions on that, the item 5 is Executive Director's Report. So back to you again, Erik.
Actually, Mr. Chair, if we could have approval of the May 16th commission minutes.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Yes, we do need that approval, and so we're looking for a motion to approve the agenda minutes from the May 16th meeting.
So moved.
All right, we have a motion.
Second. Oh, wait a minute, is this minutes? I'm sorry, I would abstain.
You don't have a second yet? Is that what's happening? Second.
All right, and we have some motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right, any opposed? Motion,
Abstention? 2 abstentions.
3 abstentions, right? You got that, Ashley? Yes, so, yep.
Are you abstaining too?
Well, I wasn't here, I don't know. What's the normal practice here?
You know, I think some folks feel comfortable abstaining from approving minutes from items they didn't vote on, but we want to make sure we at least have a quorum to approve the minutes. So at the risk of asking...
Yeah, we have 10 commission members here presently.
Okay.
And did I count that right?
Yeah.
11. The commission goes to 11, sorry.
So we're good.
So
we have-
I think we had 5
we did.
requested abstentions. So that would put 6 yeses, 0 nos, 5 abstentions. We just, if we could have a quick show of hands for those abstaining so that the clerk can capture those names. 4 abstentions, excuse me.
So we're good.
So Clerk Alatorre, does that mean 7 ayes, 0 no, 4? I'm having a hard time counting this evening, obviously. 704. Is that indeed the vote we have that we will record?
All right, so with that, motion carries 704. Thank you very much. And then we will now go to item 5, which is Executive Director's Report. Back to you, Erik.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commission members. Welcome back to the Stockton City Council chambers. A few items in my written, report that I'd like to highlight for you. Since our last commission meeting, the commission's hosted a couple of a workshop and a forum. The workshop was on Delta lodging, held on May 17th. The second annual Delta Heritage Forum was on June 6th. Great attendance for both of these. The lodging workshop was an experiment. I really tip my hat to Virginia Gardner, who organized it. And we're looking at how we can provide alternative lodging opportunities in the Delta, understanding that we probably won't have a rush of new hotels being built in the interior Delta anytime soon, but we certainly have opportunities, whether they're farm stays or Airbnbs or even camping on really great properties that would provide alternative lodging opportunities for people wanting to visit the Delta. And then the Heritage Forum, which was organized by Blake Roberts, was very well attended, over 70 participants. The theme was focused on World War II heritage because we were in the midst of celebrating the 75th anniversary of D-Day. But a handful of other topics were covered as well, including presenting to the assembled about the newly designated Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta National Heritage Area. So a very successful forum, one we intend to replicate in the future, and increasingly we'll focus more and more on the NHA as we proceed with that. And speaking of the NHA, the second item in my written report is just to inform the Commission that we're negotiating with the National Park Service on a cooperative agreement. This is the document that enables us to receive federal funds. And again, just a reminder to the Commission that the anticipated federal funds will begin in the federal fiscal year beginning October 1st of this year. We expect that it'll be about $150,000. That amount, once we have finalized our management plan, is expected to increase to about $250,000 to $300,000 annually. That could change if the nationwide funding for national heritage areas changes, but that's the current allocation that we are anticipating. So this cooperative agreement will enable us to receive funds beginning in federal fiscal year 2020, beginning October 1st, if indeed they pass their budget and conclude their annual budgeting process by that time. Moving on, we've talked to the Commission about our Delta sign plan, and I'm pleased to report, this is something we're working on jointly with the Delta Conservancy. I'm pleased to report that we're moving forward with Caltrans right-of-way encroachment permits, which are required for where we intend to locate these signs. And I'm very excited that we're going to be working with the California Conservation Corps to actually install the signs. And we expect all of this to occur later this year. But I wanted to update the Commission since that's something you haven't heard about in a while, but expect to see some great pictures closer toward the end of the year about where these signs are installed. Moving on with a brief update on our proposed update of the Land Use and Resource Management Plan. We continue to meet with interested Delta parties. The Commission received a June 13th letter from a number of Delta interests. It's included in the Commission meeting packet as it's an attachment, I think it's attachment 1. It's kind of cut off on my copy to this agenda item. A number of Delta-related parties were expressing concern over the proposed staff draft of the land use plan update. This followed an earlier meeting with the Commission's subcommittee. Commissioners Wynn, Cott, Van Lobensel's, and Lester Moffett are members of that subcommittee. We'll be continuing to meet with the interested parties. I don't have a timeline for when we expect to request the subcommittee to reconvene, but I expect that there will be more to report by the time the Commission next meets in September. The Economic Sustainability Plan, Recreation and Tourism, the update of that chapter of the Economic Sustainability Plan. The Commission authorized myself to execute a consultant contract at your May meeting, and that followed the approval of the final scope of work at the March meeting. We did receive 2 bids, and we awarded the contract to the Dangerman Group on June 5th. Department of General Services subsequently approved that contract. It's a $197,935 contract. the Dangerman Group, and Pete Dangerman is here in the audience, met with the commission staff earlier this week for a kickoff meeting. I'll note that these are the same group that worked on the original 2012 ESP Recreation and Tourism analysis, and we're real pleased to be welcoming them back and working with them. And you'll hear later from Dr. Jeff Michael, who is a member of the team working on the Rec and Tourism update, and you'll be hearing from him regarding the Ag chapter update of the ESP. The water resilience portfolio, this is Governor Newsom's, coming out of Governor Newsom's executive order. He tasked the Natural Resources Agency, Cal EPA, and the Department of Food and Agriculture to develop this water resilience portfolio. There have been a number of opportunities for people to comment on what should be in that portfolio. I know that one of them was hosted by the State Board of Food and Ag that Commissioner Eddy is responsible for coordinating. And the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, which Chair Villegas sits on, had a session on that earlier this week in Sacramento at their meeting. The staff report includes a website for this effort and also an email address that any comments can be submitted to. Moving on, I just want to alert you that our Delta Waterway cleanup will be on September 21st. That'll be 2 days after our next commission meeting. We're still in the process of finalizing the locations, but we'll be in each of the 5 Delta counties, and we'll be, as usual, seeking volunteers to help assist with the cleanup efforts. Pretty light month on land use. I can certainly answer any questions about our land use comment letters. The last 2 items I wanted to draw your attention to is that we do have a Best of the Delta contest that's currently underway. The voting closes on August 1st. You can vote on the visitcadelta.com website. This is the 3rd annual Best of the Delta survey. This was one of those things that came out of the Delta Leadership Program. That was a project for Delta Leadership Program 2017. This will be the 3rd version of it. The winners and runners-up will be announced on August 5th and honored on August 14th at the California Delta Chambers meeting and mixer in Lodi. And then finally, something new in the commission meeting packet is an update on our website and social media efforts. These are coordinated by our communications specialist, Stacy Hayden, and the report looks something like this. And I found it interesting just to see where people are landing on both the commission website, the Visit CA Delta website, and the affiliated social media locations on both Twitter and Facebook. And there's some examples there of the type of posts that Stacy is putting up there. Really pleased with those efforts, and thanks to Stacy for them. Finally, my report always concludes with a list of upcoming events in the Delta. It's summertime, so there's a lot of them. Avail yourselves of one or many of these events, and unless there are any questions, Mr. Chair, that's my report.
All right, thank you very much, Eric. A lot of good information. Are there any questions or comments on anything that Eric just reported on? No, seeing none. I just wanted to underscore as my responsibility serving as chair of this commission, serving on the Delta Stewardship Council, and appointed to the DPAC, as Eric indicated, under the Water Resilience Portfolio update. We did have a listening session as part of the DPAC meeting, and it was a good, cordial meeting where I think the secretary laid out the responsibility in the governor's executive order, and so I wanted to just bring that to the commission's attention, that I sit on that body and represented the DPC there. So, all right. Skip. All right.
No comment.
We're gonna leave that one alone. All right. So seeing no questions, seeing no questions or comments on the executive director report, takes us to item 6, which is the DPAC report. I know Mr. Pruner is here. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We met as we have regularly on July 8. I don't know if I'm glad to say this or not, but this is the first time in a very long time that our meeting ended early, although 10 minutes early off the allotted 2-hour time. I say that to simply say that these members work very hard. They take their roles very seriously and listen and engage fully in everything that's brought before them to give you the best possible input that we can. The highlights are primarily a revision of our charter. We hope to be able to bring back, in consultation with Erik, a revision of our charter that will primarily address the 15 members and how they're appointed. Currently, all the members are appointed pretty much as a group at one time, unless there are resignations, and then those are handled on a one-by-one basis. The result is that staff, and I believe the commission, is kind of burdened once every 3 years or so with a kind of a big job, and it just makes better sense. And the mayor of West Sacramento, Chris Gabaldon, suggested this, I think, a number of years ago, and we're finally implementing it. And our discussion really centered around how do we switch from the current system, where most of us are up, I think, next year, as I recall, to a phase-in system where all 15 come up 5 every 3 years. So we've kind of centered in general, we've built some consensus around an idea of a, for lack of a better term, which would be called a phase-in approach. Of course, it would be 3 years, and kind of get everybody equalized, and then create a system within that so that there are special appointments or resignations, it doesn't disrupt that schedule. That way staff at maybe the May meeting would present a slate, or if there could be some, at the discretion of the chair, of course, when that slate would, that group would come forward. We think that would be a better service to the commission. I think staff is on board with this as well. So we hope at your next meeting to have a concrete proposal for you to consider and go forward with. That's the most important thing I think I have to report. I'm glad to accept. Oh, one other thing. We've received, after our meeting, a request from the Stewardship Council to come to the Delta Protection Advisory Committee and discuss a public participation plan. So I'm extremely curious and anxious to see what that participation plan might be, since it's one of my big things is increased participation. So we'll do our best to advise and then report back to you on the outcome of that agenda item if it in fact comes forward. That's my report, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Are there any questions or comments regarding Mark's report? All right. As usual, thank you very much, Mark, for your work and the work of the commission.
Mr. Chair, can I append one thing onto that report, which is I expect at the next commission meeting, I'll bring an item for appointment for a recreation seat. We have one of those recreation seats. We have 2 on the advisory committee. One of them is up for reappointment. And then we do have a vacancy for a conservation and habitat entity representative. And so we'll be putting the call out for both of those next week, I hope. And we'll vet applications with your participation, I hope, and bring suggested appointees to the next commission meeting. But I just wanted to mention that. Just 2 this time, but that'll bring us to a full complement of advisory committee members.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Mark. And be sure to thank the committee for their continued work on our behalf. Thank you. All right. That takes care of item 6. Item 7 is a presentation on the agricultural chapter update of the Economic Sustainability Plan. And I believe, Eric, you're going to introduce Dr.
Yeah, I would just like to introduce Dr. Jeff Michael from the University of the Pacific. Jeff's someone who's familiar to many of the commissioners. His involvement with the commission goes back to the 2012 Economic Sustainability Plan. He was really the lead on completing the analysis for the commission, and we're really pleased that he's part of the team. The team's focused at CSU Chico, but part of the team that's been working on the agriculture chapter update of the Economic Sustainability Plan, and he'll be presenting on that tonight. At the conclusion, Mr. Chair, at some point, maybe after you ask for public comment, I'd like to talk a little bit about what, from the staff's perspective, we believe the next steps will be in this process, what we do with this information that Dr. Michael's presenting tonight.
All right. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be back here. It's always great to talk to the Delta Protection Commission. Just as a reminder, the update of the agriculture chapter of the Economic Sustainability Plan a few months ago, I presented some of the preliminary results of that to this group. So as Erik mentioned, this is a collaboration with CSU Chico. They're actually the leads on this contract. I'm collaborating with them. The Center for GIS there has led all the data compilation, really detailed agricultural data. It's been very time-consuming and detailed process, and some excellent faculty from their economics and geography department have been helping out, particularly on the parts that I'm going to discuss today. It is summertime. Many of those faculty are actually out of the country here, so I'll be kind of giving a pretty high-level overview of their work, some of which I was not the lead on. Phase 1, I was the lead on, and we presented that.
Can I just say,
time.
Jeff, that this is in front of all the commission members. This is the copy
PowerPoint.
of the PowerPoint, and I believe there were some copies out front for those attending in the audience.
Right. So in March, I presented the trend analysis of cropping patterns and the economic impact analysis of Delta agriculture. There's 3 other tasks that were in the project. One was to, phase 2 or task 2 was to look at conservation and ecosystem restoration projects and the intersection with agriculture in the Delta. The next task 3 was to do some analysis of salinity and water quality. That's pretty technical, so that's going to be a little bit difficult to present today. And task 4 was to look at some climate change issues. So just a super quick review of what I talked about last time. This is just a key map that I wanted to show again that shows agricultural land cover by crop type in the Delta, and this is for 2016. So it gives you an example of the data that's been compiled. I reviewed that in detail last time, but it's important as we go through this analysis that there's clear spatial patterns in the data and crop types across the Delta, and those patterns become important as we think about some of these potential changes in the Delta and the other tasks. So that's useful background through which to see all these sorts of things. Just to review some of the task 1 stuff from the last time, we found that farm revenue in 2016 was just shy of $1 billion, 965 million. I'm pretty darn confident that it's in excess of $1 billion now, but don't have any current update on that. And the trend analysis showed that wine grapes and almonds have increased the most in terms of acreage. There's been some decrease in field crops, and asparagus are notable decreases. Wine grapes are now #1 in value. The first time we went through this, I believe it was processing tomatoes were just a nose ahead of wine grapes. That's not true anymore. Wine grapes are far and away the highest value crop in terms of revenue in the Delta. Corn is still #1 in acreage. Corn and alfalfa are pretty equal, and they are still the top in acreage, even though they've declined some over time. Looking at some of the economic impact analysis, we found that the farms support nearly $1.4 billion in food and beverage manufacturing activity across the state of California. So, not only are they supporting jobs and economic activity on the farms themselves and the communities surround them, but there's a lot of, canneries, wineries, et cetera, that are adding value to those products that wouldn't be able to do what they do were it not for Delta agriculture. So if we look at this comprehensive picture that includes processing that's supported by Delta agriculture as well as the activity on itself, that we found Delta agriculture directly and indirectly supports 16,000 jobs across the 5 Delta counties and 23,000 jobs if we expand that net to all of California. That's similar to to what we found in 2011 when we looked at this in terms of employment impacts. So the number's actually just a tiny bit lower, probably related to some crop shifting and technological change, but it's very much relatively similar. So turning to these three tasks, task 2, and I just have 2 or 3 slides, real high-level overview today. Erik and staff have got much lengthier technical reports on this. But on the issue of conservation and restoration, so this is an update of a previous economic sustainability plan. I just want to, where was the previous plan in 2011 and 2012, highlighted this as actually the greatest threat to Delta agricultural activity and production long term, because the 2011-2012 Economic Sustainability Plan was based on the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. So we based that analysis on the November 2010 draft of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. So that plan has not been active for a number of years now. But if you recall that plan, it talked about over 100,000 acres of conservation land in the Delta, centered on tens of thousands of acres of tidal habitat restoration right in the sort of core farming areas of the Delta. That's the biggest change between where we are then and now. That was the part that had the biggest impact. In addition, the way the BDCP, important projects that sort of remain on the agenda, like bypasses, whether that's YOLO bypass or Paradise Cut, way that those were talked about in the BDCP had much larger periods of inundation that would be more disruptive of agriculture than where those plans are today. So that's another big change to it. So that's reduced quite a bit. And we actually found back then also that BDCP was looking at a 15,000 CFS 5 intake tunnel, even a larger tunnel than we were familiar with WaterFix. And we actually found that the habitat portion of the BDCP was of a greater impact on agriculture just because of the massive land use change than the tunnel. So that's sort of what we found before, and updating it now, this is a massive change where we are today. There's still a lot of conservation and restoration projects going on in the Delta, but I think the agenda and the plan that's out there today is much more focused on projects that have high conservation value, and there's certainly effort being put in consideration into minimizing potential conflicts with agriculture. So there's a lot of numbers on this table, but basically, we used a source called EcoAtlas that most of the agencies and conservation groups and nonprofits sort of working in this space submit their data for projects, and we pulled that in and sort of intersected that with our agricultural data. And it gives us an idea of what's the current state of conservation and restoration projects in the Delta. We can look at what's been completed already, what was defined as sort of in implementation, and what's defined as proposed. And so if you look at the proposal, this is a big change, because when we intersect that with agricultural production, we were at less than 5,000 acres of Delta agriculture that intersects with currently proposed projects. It's a far cry from the nearly 100,000 acres that we were talking about in the draft BDCP. So some big changes there that change the potential impact. There's too many projects out there for us to take a deep dive at them all, but we did try to identify any projects that when we just sort of intersected it with the agricultural activity, were flagged as intersecting over $1 million in crop production as currently construed there, to take a closer look at these and what the potential impact would be. And so that identified 4 projects that intersect with $1 million or more of 2016 agricultural production. McCormick-Williamson tract was defined as a planned project in our data, but that one broke ground last year, so I think as of today it sort of slips into the participation category. So that one had $1.5 million in 2016 revenue, some processing tomatoes out there in 2016. There won't be a lot of agricultural activity going on on that tract as this project is done, as I understand it. Another one that came up is in Contra Costa County in Knightson. There's a wetland restoration project there that it appears that the local communities are sort of on board with that. It has, like many of these projects, it has flood control benefits and environmental benefits that the community want. But it will affect crops that are grown on that property as of today. So there's a little over $1 million in production on that parcel as of 2016. Paradise Cut down in South San Joaquin County, $1.75 million in current crops on nearly several thousand acres that are in that area. But this is a flood bypass. This is not like a tidal marsh restoration that will eliminate agriculture in that area. It will affect it. There's actually some almonds in there that I don't think will probably be there once this project's implemented. And certainly there may be some years where when the bypass floods that could affect agriculture, but in most years, my understanding is agriculture would sort of proceed as normal. And so I don't have a specific estimate of what would be lost, but it would be a pretty small portion of that 1.75 million. And the last project is the YOLO bypass. Much of this actually isn't in the legal delta, so it's sort of, how to treat this or include it. But I think it's important to mention, because this is an important project that's been the subject of a lot of work. And we got a little bit of pushback in 2011-12 about the way we analyze this, because we just followed the 2010 BDCP, which said that this bypass was going to be flooded very late into the season, and it would have pretty big impacts. And I think if you look at the old economic sustainability plan, it talks about, it could be $6, $7, $8 million of crop loss from the way the YOLO bypass was described then. Well, there's been a lot of work on that. Economists at UC Davis have been working on it. The Bureau of Reclamation has been working on it. A lot of people have been working on refining that plan over the years. My understanding is of the current proposal, when I looked at the EIR, all the scenarios cut off inundation by March 15th, which is what the Davis researchers found makes a big difference. It's sort of like the sweet spot where the flooding beyond then sort of diminished conservation benefits and had big impacts on agriculture. So by pulling that back, their estimates are that although it affects a lot of agriculture, that a few $100,000 in crop revenue on an annual basis would be what would be coming from this very large YOLO bypass project. So again, a small fraction of the millions of dollars of crops that are grown out in that area. So looking at these, I guess, the conclusion that can be drawn is that, and this was the position of the commission in 2011 and 2012, even when we were raising, some alarm bells about the extent of restoration activity, is that the conclusion is that well-planned conservation actions are consistent with the Delta agriculture economy. For evidence of that, look no further than 14,000 acres that are in currently completed conservation reserves and planned projects in the Delta that are actually that are contributing to the agricultural economy and generating crops today. Wetland restoration projects have the biggest potential for conflict. Our analysis shows that it could affect about 2,000 acres in the Delta and up to $3 million in agricultural revenue. So that's less than 0.5% of current Delta agricultural production. So to put that in perspective.
Dr. Markowitz?
Yeah.
Doctor, I have a question on that 2,000 acres. Mm-hmm. In Solano alone, we've got a Lookout Slough project is 3,200 acres, and Little Egbert, I think, is similar in acreage. So does that number doesn't reflect those two projects, obviously, that 2,000 acres?
I'll check that and get back to you.
Okay.
Yeah. Did you make note of those projects? Or the notes with me, but, yeah, I'll have to check that. Salinity analysis. So what we've done here is very is pretty technical, and just as an introduction to this, salinity is certainly an important and a long controversial issue in Delta water quality. It can affect farmers in a lot of ways. It can reduce the yield of crops when they're irrigated with saline water. Farmers can take actions to sort of reduce the effects of salinity. And even if those are successful, those actions can be costly to farmers and increase their cost of production. Salt can accumulate in soil over time, and it can even affect crop choice in the Delta, where some crops can't be grown and others can. Particularly if we look at the spatial patterns, we see that there's a lot of pasture land in the Delta out in areas that have the sort of the most saline water. The previous analysis, and I'm not talking about the ESP here, but analysis of salinity in the Central Valley agriculture in the past has sort of relied on programming models. And programming models, in the slide, it sounds like I hate them. I probably should have used better language. I don't hate them. They're actually very useful forecasting models. It's sort of been a workhorse model, but they're forecasting models that allow you to project. You make a lot of assumptions about the way farmers operate in current conditions, and then you project a change in conditions, environmental, market, or otherwise, and make a prediction of how farmers would adapt. But the predictions for these models are very sensitive to the assumptions in them. You're loading a lot of assumptions and parameters into them. The data is used primarily to set the baseline. So it is a good way to get an estimate of a potential impact, but you have to be careful because the assumptions are really important. So there is some analysis that's been done, like a paper in 2014 from researchers at UC Davis using this model that shows that salinity doesn't have much of an impact on Delta agriculture if it were to go up. But it relies on assumptions, under certain scenarios, obviously extreme scenarios that have an impact. But it's a programming model where you put in an assumption crop by crop of, what's the threshold where salinity starts to affect the crop, and then how does that go up over time. And those assumptions, how that affects on any given parcel, it's highly reliant on soil conditions and all sorts of local conditions that you can't see, and can be highly variable across the Delta. And so you have to be careful about a projection like that. So these sorts of models were applied to the Delta generally assume that under current conditions are suitable, that salinity will not have any impact on crops grown in the Delta. And so that's an assumption that might be tested. So a paper in 2014, this paper in the conclusions has a conclusion that says total crop losses from salinity increases are small because most affected areas already have a low value crop mix. So my critical analysis of that sort of assumption is to say, hold on, most areas that are impacted by salinity already have a low value crop mix. You're showing that under current conditions there seems to be some correlation between salinity and crop choice, but the assumptions in your model say there should not be because the thresholds are higher. I don't know if this makes sense to you, but it's important. There's a reason, I guess one of the reasons I'm going through this is that the salinity analysis is very focused on crop choice, and I'm explaining why I'm sort of focused on this particular technical issue, because I think there's an important question that needs to be looked at critically in the scientific literature. And so this is the one part of the analysis where sort of our goal is actually to publish journal articles out of it that, you know, academics read and will be in front of boards. So one way to test that assumption is to take an econometric approach. And this is an approach we actually took in the 2011-12 ESP. I actually worked on that with initially with David Sundin at the Brattle Group in UC Berkeley. This is actually an adaptation of a model that he was using to predict crop choice in other settings. We applied it to the Delta, and we sort of found some statistically significant relationships between crop planting and salinity in the Delta under current conditions, which suggests that sort of the programming models using to project salinity effects may be underestimating things, that they may be setting those sort of thresholds where impacts hit at too high a level, that they may actually be somewhat lower than that. In the updated analysis, I've worked with a couple of really good young agricultural economists at CSU Chico, Anita Chowdhury and Janine Stone, came there from Colorado State. They haven't worked in the Delta before, but they've worked with these kind of models before and are very up to date. They've actually done most of the technical work here, and I'm sort of summarizing some of this today. But it's actually an improvement of what we did in 2011 and 12. Part of it is because we have more data. So we've got this crop level data now going out to 2016. So we had another 6 years of data. We've increased the complexity of the analysis from 6 crop groups to 17 crop groups to focus more closely on things. And then we've also added another control where we can do a better job for controlling for other aspects. So in the old ESP, we sort of had a cross-sectional model. We had time series data, but we didn't have what's called a panel. And I'm sorry for non-stats people here, but here we actually took the time to create a second model where we had a true panel data, which means we only used parcels, pieces of land that we observed in the data every year for a significant number of years where there was some variation in salinity. And that allowed us to, even without observing like local conditions, I might not have data on specifically, you know, what's the soil in this place, I still have ways to statistically control what might be special about a place in a way that's sort of better than what we had in 2011 and 12. So there's a multivariable analysis controls for other parcel characteristics. Now, this particular technical report is not yet final. We're still working through some of the technical details in it. In some ways, so it shows some salinity impacts in Delta, of crop choice in the Delta. In some ways, they're a little bit smaller than what we found in 2011 and 2012, but they're still there and significant. And I think that we've controlled for more factors so that the results are more solid, even if they aren't quite as strong. So I just pulled a couple of quotes from the draft. We find that parcels in locations with lower irrigation salinity tend to have more parcels in orchards and vineyards. Don't like to grow those in higher salinity areas. That result weakened, though, in the model where we had better controls for local characteristics and the fixed effects. The stronger results that sort of held through all models was the evidence that when growing season salinity is higher, the farmers are more likely to switch to pasture and certain field crops that are not high revenue crops. And we also found some evidence that higher salinity, we see less growing of certain vegetable crops that are reported in the literature to have higher sensitivity to salinity. So there's some more analysis on this to do to look at like what it means to project forward in changing conditions. That has to be done. We're focused on the salinity here, not saying that salinity is the driving force in crop choice in the Delta. I think there are other factors that are more important, particularly in most areas of the Delta where water quality is better. But there is we are are showing some impacts under current conditions. And so that means that when you project forward to a policy change, you might get a little different projection of impacts if you look forward at a policy change. So we think it's important to kind of give this second look so that there can be sort of a second opinion on some of the projections of policy changes. So the last task, this is the one that I know the least about, is the climate change analysis, so please don't pepper me with lots of questions on this. This one is the one task I was not heavily involved in. This was led by Dean Fairbanks, professor of geography at CSU Chico, who is currently out of the country, his colleague Noriyuko Sato. And looking at climate change effects sort of primarily through two areas, sea level rise and how temperature changes could affect crops in the delta. The issue of sea level rise really hits the levee system. That's sort of a whole, I didn't even want to touch this issue because there's so much analysis of it in other settings, and it's so important. But they did look at it a bit, and I think it's something that everybody knows, particularly under some of the higher sea level rise scenarios and projections we're looking at now. It's going to put a lot of stress over the years on the delta levee system, and so there'll certainly be increasing costs to keep up with that over time. Also looked at the crop mix in the delta and looking at which crops might be sensitive to rising temperatures, and called out for special concern some of the chill sensitive perennial crops that could struggle. So on the sea level rise levee vulnerability, they identified 250,000 acres of cropland that was potentially vulnerable to sea level rise. Now, what the real effects are really has to do, or what the effects are going to be, have to do with what we choose to do when it comes to, levees and flood control and adaptation in the delta. And certainly, under climate change scenarios, the cost to protect this land is going to increase. And those costs are sort of beyond what, in many cases, the agricultural economies of the land can sustain, but has been described, I know, before this council many times in other papers. The interest and the integrity of the delta levee system go far, far beyond the crops on the other side of the levee. So this is a sort of a complex issue, but certainly agriculture is at risk. Looking at temperature impacts at crops, they were using some recent climate change assessments that say that temperature change could be pretty high, as much as 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and looked at how that could affect crops. And they raised concerns about, as I mentioned, perennial fruit and nut tree crops, particularly those that need winter chilling hours. As those are diminished, those crops could be less successful in the delta. Things like pears would fall in that category. Also some concerns about annual crops that are sensitive to excessive heat. If under climate change scenarios, there's a list of some of those crops that they identified, from corn to cucumbers and potatoes, that could have some negative effects. Some crops might respond well to higher temperatures and could benefit from it, including tomatoes and citrus and potentially alfalfa. So that's it for my quick summary. I'm sure I went well beyond the allotted time.
Well, thank you, Dr. Michael. Are there any questions or comments? Yes, sir. Commissioner Biaggi.
Dr. Michaels, interesting. Got a question. When you look for aquifers, you dig wells, right? You know how it is. When you look with salinity, do you test the soil or the water in that area when you get all the data?
No, we don't. So like, what does economists have to contribute to the salinity debate? I'm serious. I mean, because the approach has been, you know, you've got to know the soil conditions, you have to know the water conditions. And this is one of the things that challenges these projections of policy changes is there's not good information on that. And so I've observed these hearings where, you know, scientists and dueling experts go back and forth like hammering each other, and at the end of the day it sort of comes down to, you know, we just don't have good information on the local conditions, and if you assume one thing, you get one answer, and you assume something else, you get something else. And so that's one thing that's different in this approach. It's like, what is it that we can observe for all of these parcels? And what we can observe and analyze as economists is what farmers are doing. And trying to look at the choices that they're making. And so if we find areas where, you know, we control for a lot of other characteristics, and we find that irrigation water salinity can affect some of the choices that farmers are making, particularly the seeming increasing propensity for pasture and forage in some of the areas with water quality challenges, then we're showing a potential effect than we could project from that.
You're telling me it's hard to get data, right? A lot of assumptions, aren't you, huh?
It's hard to get data. So
why don't you get data? Why don't you check the water and the soil in an area and say, this is how the salinity is here and there? It would seem that would be the logical thing to do from a layman.
So we're getting a little bit out of my area. That's some of the recommendations that I had actually coming out of the last 2012 ESP was that the state really, you know, if you're going to make regulatory changes in here, you need better, and you're going to do it based on these models, you need to go out and collect the data you need on the local conditions and to show that the assumptions are correct. I have not collected that data. So I suppose one way that one might interpret our results, even if you don't sort of believe the econometric model that you don't understand, I would suggest that it leads even greater weight to the need to, if you're going to rely on scientific data, that this puts even greater weight because it sort of calls into question some of the assumptions that people may have been making, and I think makes it even more important to get that local data on the agricultural conditions in order to sort of take the more traditional you know, agricultural, I guess, or scientific approach.
Commissioner Biaggi, you have a question?
Yeah, I'd like to, I have a lot of respect for you. I've heard you speak a lot of times, and
I'm sorry?
I have a lot of respect for you. I've heard you speak quite a few times, and except for today, unfortunately. Salinity doesn't impact the Delta. That's the most ridiculous thing I could have ever heard in my life. Because if I'm going to trade crops from tomatoes and cucumbers and pumpkins, and now I'm going to plant ryegrass, the economic impact is incredibly high. So how can you say that we can farm with salinity when we can't? And that's proven. There's data. There's so much data by UC Davis that's taller than this building that tells you can't raise tomatoes at 1,000 parts per million salt.
Right.
And so, to me, that's misleading as hell. It's unfortunate that a very intelligent man as yourself would say something like that, or am I misinterpreting what you're saying?
I think you're misinterpreting, actually. There's certainly nothing in here that says that you can grow tomatoes well at 1,000 micro Siemens per centimeter EC. It's just
go back to your slide where it says no or very little impact on the Delta. That's misinformation.
Well, one of those slides I was we're describing small impacts was describing analysis of others that found small impacts under change. And so that's not our results. But, well, I should say our results aren't showing necessarily really large impacts under current conditions. But That description was of other studies that show relatively small impacts, and so this is a difficulty of presenting something, the technical.
That was DWR study. That way they didn't have to have the delta as clean as we want.
Right. Other, yes, sir, Tom?
Yeah, I've listened to you many times, Doctor, too. I was totally confused, so I'm agreeing with him. I took something totally different away from what is actually the truth, and Mr. Biaggi is accurate. And I know that we don't want to get in the weeds of how all this was developed, but if you start talking about negative or small impacts from salinity levels, and then 5 years later go in and talk about the same acreage that was pulled out of production because of salinity levels, it will distort the next experiment that you put onto it and not give a fair analysis. There is no way on earth any salinity is good for agriculture. That statement cannot be made, and I think it's wrong to present it. But I could be missing something. But I agree with Mr. Biaggi. Something's haywire here. When you can say any impacts to the agricultural commodity that you're growing from salinity have to be negative. Would we agree with that?
Yeah, I don't think we said that salinity is positive.
No, you're right. You didn't say that. But I'll stand by, excuse me, that gentleman. I missed something, Doctor, because I don't think that's your point.
No, I mean, and that's we're not, at least at this point, actually analyzing and making a specific prediction of if salinity were to go to 1,000, what would that do? So a couple points to make. One is that this is analysis. I talked about a lot of ways that farmers could react or salinity could affect them. This is looking at one of them, sort of a crop choice, which is actually a more extreme choice. I mean, salinity would affect your yields on what you're growing today before you would shift a crop. So you might endure negative effects that aren't captured in this. We're only looking at a crop choice model because that's sort of something that we can observe to test some assumptions that have been made about conditions in the Delta. So farmers could be certainly affected beyond what we say here, though, if they have to shift to lower revenue crops. There could be additional effects even for those that don't shift because they're spending more money on drainage, or they're suffering reduced yields and things of that effect. But the crop choice piece is one of the more extreme adaptations, and we do show evidence of farmers doing it or have salinity affecting what goes on in the Delta today under current conditions. And what I'm saying is that under some of the models that are used to make policy choices, the assumption in those models is that it should have no effect under current conditions because water quality is being maintained at a level that it sits below the thresholds that are assumed in the models. And so what we're saying is we're looking at the data, what farmers are growing today, and if we find a relationship between current salinity levels and what they choose, and that suggests that if there's an effect at the current levels today, it suggests that maybe some of those assumptions are wrong that are built into the models that agency might use for policy decisions. So I probably just confused you even more. Maybe we need to give like an hour and a half long talk on this specific topic, and we're still sort of working on some of the details there. But in a lot of ways, what's here is actually very similar to what was in the 2011 and 12 Economic Sustainability Plan, and it's a model that actually was used by DWR to look at Bay Delta Conservation Plan effects. The results in most cases are consistent with what we found then, but I think the scientific methods that we're applying now, they're stronger and bringing more data to the task, so that I think they will stand up in the long run.
I would add my comments. I've heard you speak various times in different subjects, and I've always appreciated your comments and your research. In this particular case, well, first of all, when you talked about the expanded number of jobs created by agriculture outside of the agricultural realm itself, one question, because, for example, Lodi grows a tremendous number of grapes which are shipped to Napa and used in their wines. Is that a factor in regards to the expanded number of jobs created, or does that have any impact whatsoever in your analysis?
No, it does. So in that, one of the bullets on the slide said, including processing like wineries, it was 16,000 jobs in the 5 Delta counties and 23,000 statewide. And a big part of that was actually wine grapes that are being going to wineries outside of the Delta counties. So supporting jobs, in Gallo, down in Stanislaus, or over in Napa, or other areas, is one of the significant pieces of that. Probably the most significant actual piece of that expanded statewide impact.
Okay. The other question, though, and you talk about modeling and assumptions, and the reason I bring it up is because there's scientific evidence usually based upon observation and testing it over and over and having it validated, et cetera. And then there's hypothetical or theoretical, which are based upon modeling, based upon assumptions made outside of that particular calculation. One thing that I've heard from my constituents, obviously I have an agricultural district, but there's been an impact on the way they farm in regards to, for example, the overtime regulations placed on farm laborers, and the other part is in regards to the access or availability of laborers, which, as you know, has been dropping, almost annually. And so sometimes they make a choice not necessarily based upon the land or the water or the salinity. They make it based upon an economic factor of whether they can, gather their crops, once they're finalized. And I guess my question is that a consideration in regards to the economic future of agriculture? So certainly, a lot of them are going to technology, mechanization, et cetera, or automation, because they find that even, for example, grape harvesters, which you would never think you could harvest a grapevine, with a machine. But these are all things that are happening because the cost of doing business with labor is becoming rather expensive. So that's just a question.
Well, it's a great question. I happen to agree with you. I think that the issues related to labor are probably the biggest issue in agriculture today, and how it's changing, in the Delta and across the Central Valley, in California. That was not a specific task that we were to look at, and I think I would suggest that in future updates maybe to look at that a bit, but I know DPC is more focused on the resource management issues, so it's natural maybe that wouldn't be primary. But it might be one reason why our models, for example, show a little bit lower job creation today from agriculture that's actually grown somewhat in value, and it could be that it reflects the changing use of labor and substitution and changing agricultural practices. So you don't get quite as much employment impact as you might have in the past. If we were to update this 10 years from now, we might see dramatically different numbers. Right now, I'm saying it's just a tiny bit lower, but we might see something really completely different 5 or 10 years down the line.
Well, the last point, actually 2 points. One is, in your research, I assume you talked to a variety of farmers and asked their practices built into your modeling, et cetera. Is that correct?
There is some communications with farmers. We didn't do a lot of formal sets of focus groups, or at one point There was discussion of doing a survey, but I think we didn't have the resources to do that. So, so there is sort of anecdotal discussions with farmers and knowledge of it that inform it. But yeah, I have to admit that farmer surveys or really extensive focus groups with farmers is not a significant part of this scope as it might have been.
And my last comment is that I appreciate, obviously, your efforts, and it obviously makes a difference in regards to the way we view things. The last thing that I hear from agriculture in general is the cost of increased regulation, which, when you have all these requirements that, whether it be documentation or, the use of pesticides, et cetera, it drives up the cost and sometimes makes a farmer, a business owner, obviously, make changes in the way they do business, with their particular agricultural product. And I think that's a factor, because one of the things that I see is that because it's costing more to stay in business and to maintain that profit level, cost based upon, government regulation, is another factor. You talk about economic sustainability. Sustainability is something built upon where you can improve each year you go, as opposed to regressing, and whether it be crop losses and weather and, with the cherries, et cetera. So anyway, that's just my comment, because I think the sustainability, economic sustainability, is maybe a wider view. But again, I understand the, maybe the parameters you've been given. So, but I certainly appreciate your presentation.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a good comment for sort of future iterations of this, because we've seen some erosion in profitability of farming in the past couple of years that sort of weren't in the years and things that we were looking at. So I think that's another issue to look at in the future. Things have really changed compared to 5 years ago in terms of the profitability of per acre.
Commissioner Burgess?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that my observation and my reaction to you wasn't that you were saying that salinity was good and that it was all right. I see that it is impacting, and it's impacting profitability and sustainability, so I just wanted to make sure I put that out. One of the things that I see in agriculture in Contra Costa, and I've just been kind of watching it, is hemp. And so I wonder if there will be other types of crops that may be more salinity tolerant that may come up and will improve economic opportunities as well. That's
a good question. I think we did pick up less than 1 acre of that in our 2016 data in the Delta, maybe more today.
The most recent data that I have is there's now 185 statewide with about 11,855 acres in the state. I don't know in the Delta at this point.
All right, so we do have at least one slip for some public comment, and then we can bring it back to the commission for further discussion. So Deidre, do you want to come up?
I just wanted to say, as somebody who participated in comments on the South Delta salinity standards that the Water Board set, and as a scientist who's worked on Delta issues for a decade, the Water Board gave Metropolitan Water District a couple $1 million, and Metropolitan Water District oversaw the scientist that did the agricultural economic impact analysis. And that scientist said that increasing the EC standard to 1,000 was going to have no impact on Delta agriculture. Every Delta farmer knew that was wrong. This is the kind of biased science that we're getting out of these, and I'm very concerned. I've heard that for the voluntary settlement agreements, the statewide, there is for the new, there's going to be a new scientific basis report that for the voluntary settlement agreements in the Delta, and I've heard Jennifer Pierre, the manager for the state water contractors, is overseeing the rewrite in the VSAs. And again, these people have economic interests against it. when I've looked into things in detail, I've seen over and over again the bias in these computer models. I'm a computer modeler. I argued very strongly they needed, in that when we asked for, there's a statewide water swap model, we asked for the maps, the land use maps that they used to calibrate the swap model, and they never gave them to us. So this is the kind of battle. Dr. Michaels is absolutely right, these models, and I will posit to you that to the extent people won't even disclose, one, the models aren't adequately calibrated, and two, they won't even disclose the data to scientists like myself when they ask for them. So I think it's a real problem. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other public comment on this item? Right, so seeing none, are there any further comments? Because I think what I'm gathering here, Eric, there is at least some confusion, and maybe in light of what we heard this evening and in light of what I think you're recommending, which are some discussions about next steps, what's sort of the process for either adopting or commenting or getting clarification on the issue that we just discussed? Because it's a little bit confusing, because when you read it in the bullets, and I think I understood eventually Dr. Michael's attempt to try to explain this a little bit, but the previous analysis based on programming models then further says results that salinity does not currently impact Delta Ag is better described as a hypothesis than a research finding. So I think that distilled distinction, unless you read it all the way through and kind of start from the same space, which is these are program models that are being discussed, not independent research, it leads you to believe maybe something different than what is intended. So I think it's confusing, to say the least. So I wondered what we might be able to do to clear that up.
Yeah, well, a few thoughts. Certainly, wow. I pick up on that statement as well. That was really and now I'm trying to find it, and here it is. Thank you. That's the statement that I really keyed in on, and
so one could argue,
it's almost flipped on its head, because what I read that to mean is that salinity could be impacting Delta agriculture. It's not a research finding that there's no impact on Delta agriculture. If I could say a little bit about next steps, certainly the first next step is for the team to conclude the work on this Task 3 report. That was the salinity report. And Dr. Michael indicated that it was not yet finalized, so there's still some more work to do to complete that report. And I think he'll carry back the comments that he heard from commission members this evening. In terms of next steps for all of this work, there's really two things I wanted to report to the commission. The first thing we'll do is to get some additional outside review of these reports. It won't necessarily be academic peer review, but we'll have experts take a look at what was developed, just so we can present to the Stewardship Council for any recommendations we might make from those reports that we had outside review, so that it's good science that we're presenting to them. They're really big on best available science at the Stewardship Council, and we want to make sure that we're presenting the best possible information we can. My intention is to compile a recommendation for the Commission's review that will be transmitted to Delta Stewardship Council. Some Commission members, probably not many more beyond Commissioner Natoli, Commissioner Thompson as well, were around when the 2012 recommendations to the Delta Stewardship Council were compiled coming out of the original Economic Sustainability Plan. I don't think this will be as detailed as what the Commission prepared in 2012, because at that point there was no Delta plan. The statute said the Commission's going to complete this Economic Sustainability Plan, and it will form the basis of recommendations to inform the adoption of the Delta plan. So what I anticipate bringing back to the commission is going to be much truncated from what was forwarded to the Delta Stewardship Council in 2012. But I do want to bring that back for commission discussion and approval. I'm guessing it will be in the form of a letter addressed to the Delta Stewardship Council, but truthfully, I haven't really thought that far ahead because we're still getting our arms around what's in these 4 task reports and what we can fashion from those in the way of recommendations that might lead to changes in the Delta Plan. Our timing is really good with trying to influence the Delta Plan because, as the chair knows, the Stewardship Council is undergoing a 5-year review of the Delta Plan. It's also worth noting that even though the Delta Plan, as it addresses a lot of agricultural policies, is very general, it's also a fairly strong general statement that's in the Delta Plan. I can't quote it from memory, but the paraphrase is that it's supportive of continued agriculture as the main land use in the Delta. We'll certainly look for ways we can improve upon that statement and kind of beef up what's in the Delta Plan. But that would be the next step in this process, and I would hope we might be prepared to bring that for discussion to the commission at the September meeting, but it might be the November meeting rather than September. If that sounds okay, and I'm happy to answer any questions about those proposed next steps.
No, I think that sounds very appropriate, Terry. I just wanted to draw attention back to the topic that got a lot of the focus on the salinity. How is it, or maybe we don't know yet this evening, but it seems to me that in however we frame that transmittal to the Stewardship Council for consideration, I guess the update to the Delta Plan, that this issue about salinity gets highlighted in a way, and maybe even it would be prudent for us to look at the Delta Plan and look at how discussion currently is relative to salinity and its impacts upon certainly agricultural viability, and there are other impacts obviously to municipal and industrial users and certainly for recreation and such. And some of that obviously may be due to sea level rise, but I think the impacts, to the point that Deidre made in her comments, shouldn't be, it should be as factual as we can have it. Recognize that modeling is certainly the inputs, are, a good part determined of what the outputs are based upon your model. And it would just seem to me, though, that salinity, recognizing that fits into some of the other things relative to climate change and so forth, and it may not be caused just by man-made impacts or projects or other things that are occurring, but just occur anyway. And if so, what that means to Delta agriculture. So I think it needs to be potentially highlighted. And again, I would leave that to you and to others, obviously, who are far better informed than I am about, how you would craft that. But I think, it could be a foundational point, again, for what occurs in discussions in the Delta Plan, but obviously the work of this commission and certainly others. And I think it is foundational, though, to some of the cropping and certainly the production numbers, as well as decisions that are made by those who are actually performing agriculture, the farmers, and in some cases the ranchers who are, looking to their water source as being obviously essential to what their pursuit is, but also then it affects the economics as well as obviously the reality of what occurs in the Delta on a day-to-day basis. So I think that's an important point. I'm glad that Jeffrey and certainly my colleagues talked to it here, and I just think it needs to be included in a very clear way, however that's communicated to the Stewardship Council, and certainly in the framework of our documents as well.
And I would actually ask, as part of that, there's no reason to stop there, and I think as part of the ongoing conversation with the water resilience portfolio, I know they're getting geared up to accept public testimony in written form, and I think we ought to make sure that the message, whatever that gets distilled into, gets sent there as well, because that has to be embedded as part of a statewide water resilience portfolio, no matter what. I mean, it's just too important to not. So I think as part of this body, it's almost required of us to make sure that we make a mark there as well. And I would even go a step further to say that in whatever we transmit, it has to represent on-the-ground farmers who are actually practicing, trying to manage farming operations in light of the issues of salinity on a daily basis, and embed that in whatever format we have. I mean, this is the form with which to do that in. Not everybody's going to take the time, not everybody has the resources to do that, we recognize that. But we do, we have to, the composition of this body is intended to include that element in whatever transmission we send out. So I would encourage, Eric, if there's a way for us to find a way to include on-the-ground farmers who are actually practicing what is being talked about in many respects at the 50,000-foot level, embed that in our transmission.
Mr. Chair, if I could, so are we doing independent modeling, Dr. Michael? Are we doing our own independent modeling relative to the salinity? I know you've drawn some conclusions in your bullet points, but and the reason I'm asking that is that this might be the juncture. Again, models can be, countered by other models, and again, it's not inexpensive. But I guess my point being is that if we think there are either some flaws or it's more hypothetical than it is, whatever the comparison would be for that, then I guess I was just going to suggest that before this is all wrapped up, and I guess ask this a question first before I go any further. So, Jeff, what are we doing, and are you doing independent modeling?
Yeah, so what I sort of discussed around this issue, data-based econometric model, that's independent modeling. We compiled the data on what's been going on in the Delta for about the past decade at the field level, and have been, so those crop choice models you're talking about, yes, those are independent that we've created. What we have not done yet is to sort of, and what that does is it shows the relationship between sort of water quality and what farmers are doing today under current conditions. Right. And what we have not done yet is to sort of take the relationships we find under current conditions and try to project from them what will happen under different conditions. Okay, so that would be an extension of it, what we haven't done yet. But just that very finding that there's effects under current conditions is actually highly impactful, because as I sort of discussed is that some of the, and I think Deirdre brought this up, is some of the modeling that's done now and projections is sort of based on, there's not a lot of good data out there, and it's sort of based on assumptions that things would have to get a lot worse before we would see impacts than we have today. And so if we can detect effects under current conditions, even if they aren't enormous, and I don't think that in most areas of the Delta, salinity is a primary driver of what's going on, but if we can still show that it affects things under current conditions, that's a significant finding, because it's sort of somewhat counter to the what's assumed in some of the modeling today. So it's a process. So I'm focused on sort of establishing that finding, trying to get that sort of into the scientific literature, so that's something, once it is, then that's something that modelers have to grapple with in policy settings, and so that's sort of why we're kind of focusing on those technical issues. And I understand that it gets to be a bit of a quagmire in front of a body like this, trying to explain that.
Yeah, I'm just curious, and I know the hour's getting late, but so what about from a historical basis? In fact, as Mr. Biaggi, spoke to it, we talked about some of the islands where, historically, again, crops were grown. I think asparagus, some other things. When you look at Sherman and Twitchell, and and you look at salinity in those areas, and now you're lucky to be able to sustain forage for cattle, and and they're talking about doing other things, and as it relates to carbon sequestration and so forth. But I guess it would seem to me that reflecting currently, and certainly with the data you use from the previous economic sustainability plan, but I guess historical data, people might still debate it and look at other market forces or whatever, or mechanization, or people's choice of of crops for consumption and stuff. But and such. So it would seem to me, though, that, again, you've lived a lot of this, many of us up here have, and, it seems like for every time you put out something that, seems to be indisputable, you got some other expert come in and say, oh, well, no, that's not accurate, this is their real world. And again, we're never going to get to the point of where we're not going to have the ability for somebody to contest it. But I just think, I guess the reason I asked you the question, I appreciate your answer, and I wanted to respond a bit, is that if you needed to take any deeper dive, it would seem to me, obviously, there's a cost and a resource issue and time in order to, on this particular point, because it does go to water quality and affects a whole lot of other things. There is history behind it. There's the currency and obviously the projections for the future. You know your business far better than I do, and others in this room are far better informed. But it seems to me that this could be a very, very important, because it's one of those things that going forward, as people look at, whether it's, settlement agreements or, resiliency portfolios or whatever, that, nobody knows for certain. But we have some experience, and certainly there's 150 years of farming in the Delta, but there's also the currency of what you've done and all these models, and I still find it shocking at times that people that have the same credentials can come up with absolutely different conclusions. And again, I'm very respectful of what your work you've done. And so I guess I would just ask: is there anything else you would need to go any deeper? Are you limited by what's currently in the scope of work, and again, and you can always, chase things, but I guess from a standpoint of getting things in that would be foundational, get published and so forth, that would help, I think, certainly the cause in the future as it relates to, being real about what agricultural impacts are as it relates to water quality and salinity.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. More resources would be helpful, and deeper dives are necessary, so I will sort of file that when I make requests that Don totally agrees that we should have more resources.
Erik's going to be wincing over there. I don't. Okay. All right. Thanks.
I had a quick question. So throughout the PowerPoint, you talk about 2016. Is that going to be the base year for the analysis in terms of acreage and?
Time marches on, but in terms of that's the base year for what we've done in this project. Yes. 2017 data is now available, but we're wrapping up the analysis of the 2016 data, and they're now 2019.
Yeah, significant. Yes.
Yeah, and some of and you see these things as we looked at the crop trend analysis, we see market forces sort of pushing towards nuts and wine grapes, so that. That has the potential to actually elevate this salinity issue even more, because sort of areas where there's some sensitivity and could be some limits on market opportunities that result.
All right. Yes, sir.
Just a quick comment. Your research and your report is extremely critical, because it does lead to policy decisions made by a variety of bodies. When the SEDs first came out, they were proposing a over 40% increase in salinity. And the reason I bring that up is because, we need to see through your research and others, the effect of that and the impact of what it would be on our agricultural economic sustainability. So your work is critical in regards to a lot of things that we would decide, not just on this commission, but other bodies that we sit on. So again, thank you.
And you're referring to, there's a 42% increase in the standard.
Yep.
It doesn't necessarily mean there'll be a 42% increase in salinity, but certainly gives a lot more room to move that. So the work and the studies that decision was based on are actually some of what I'm directly talking about here, where I say sort of challenging that assumption about where those thresholds are. So it would be relevant to those proceedings in the future.
So in light of what you've heard, Erik, the last couple of speakers, are there any thoughts you have about how we might forge forward, given the limitations, the notion that the work that's before us could translate into public policy that may not reflect the full picture? Are there paths forward that we could explore? And I don't know if you have if you don't have the answer tonight, that's fine, but I think you're hearing an expression of concern about where we've stopped and the need that
Yeah, I certainly hear the concern and the sensitivity over, where a report like this might lead people to conclude or draw conclusions from. So, it's been a little challenging for me. I generally have pretty good antenna for these type of things, but it's a fairly technical report, and I was certainly challenged by just it frankly brought back cold sweats from my ag economic studies, which I concluded too late I wasn't cut out to be an ag economist, but so I went into policy work instead, where you don't need any skills. But I frankly was challenged by the report. So I think I need to, trust my instincts about, how can we translate this in a way? I think it might be just a question of how the report, which is fairly technical and scientific, is translated into a summary. Certainly, Dr. Michael attempted to do that in his PowerPoint, and I think did a pretty good job, but I think we need to maybe do a little bit more work on how we characterize it and summarize the data that's in there. Yeah. Because I don't believe it's saying salinity is not a problem for Delta agriculture, but clearly that message was coming through somehow, and so I think we need to look at how we present the information.
One thing I'll just point out is that task 3, the salinity one, that's the one task where we have not delivered the final report to Erik and staff. And the big thing that's sort of missing from that, actually, and that I've been working on and I'm a little bit behind on, is sort of a more readable summary. And so what staff have been seeing is a lot of the super sort of technical stuff that's been going back and forth between me and the technical folks at GECO, and I think it's been a little challenging for them to interpret some of that. Yeah. So that one's not finalized, and we're working on generating it to put it in a more useful format and a better context.
Right. Commissioner Eddy?
So I guess for my benefit and maybe of my colleagues, I assume the final that goes, or the draft, would include a provision that says this is what the economic impact is for salinity, for instance, and have a range? Is that what we're looking at, or no?
I don't think that what will result is sort of a model that one could use and data that one could use to analyze a policy scenario or a change scenario. So we might, we will sort of spell out the relationships and the sensitivity under current conditions. What I don't think we'll say at the end of the day is give you a number that says, the loss is 25 million if we see so many centimeters of sea level rise and intrusion. So what there will be is a model and data that the one could take and intersect with scenarios that would be hydrologic modeling that somebody would do of, if we build a tunnel or sea level rise increases, or we, these sorts of things that people are considering. So I will not be actually applying it to that in this paper, just sort of establishing the relationships we found under current conditions.
Commissioner Slater?
Yeah, and maybe there's a disconnect, Doctor. I think we're all expecting some type of number that indicates salinity causes damage to agriculture. You don't have to come up with that. I recognize the difficulty in that, but maybe that's where we're coming from. We want that noted if indeed it's accurate, which is why you're here, to indicate that salinity in the Delta will be, I don't have to say devastating, I'll say it here, has to be impactful. I see no other way around that, but if it's not true and you're saying that, fine. It needs to be readable. Yeah. That's my point. I'm not criticizing, because I know you.
We're getting to sort of basic things. Actually, So we're actually kind of go back to first principles, or I shouldn't say first principles, but like a very fundamental question is if we can show that it has effects today, then certainly it will have effects if we make a change towards greater salinity. And so, I'm focusing, I mean, that might seem like a super obvious question. I talked to farmers in the Delta, and you know, it's like, well, it's saying the sky is blue. I know this to be a fact, but we're trying to sort of take a look under current conditions, and that's sort of, you know, in science, I'm an economist, but I mean, when you do this sort of modeling and you're testing things, when you're projecting forward a change in the world, like, you know, if you're a climate change researcher and you have a model that's sort of based on your understanding of the world today, and then you can use those models to project forward, right? So you're making a projection, but it's not like a testable hypothesis, right?
Models keep changing.
Yeah.
Right, and the models can change based on our understanding of these effects of things today. And so, I mean, honestly, what we're working on here is something that sort of backs it up a little bit, and let's make sure that we have the right picture of current conditions. And like I said, my expectation is I'm not sure that everybody's going to look at this and say, oh, salinity has has impacts under current conditions because, you know, of this paper. But I think just somebody, if it forces some additional work, if people are more comfortable with the sort of on-the-ground modeling and detailed stuff, then I think that's fantastic, because as I recommended, this is what we can do with the available data, and I think that there needs to be a lot more sort of on-the-ground data about growing conditions and soils and all these sorts of things. It's the foundation of these decisions.
So we have two more presentations this evening, so I'm wondering, Erik, if you can help us sort of bring this to a close in light of what you've heard. Is there a path forward? Nothing's going to happen tomorrow.
No, of
so
course not. And I think what it comes to is what your staff brings back to the commission for recommendations to the Stewardship Council. We'll certainly work with the team to finalize this report, and it probably needs a summarization, because the report itself is very technical. I think the summarization is critically important, what conclusions one can draw from the technical report. So I'd like to take that back, and we'll do our work, finish the work first with the consultant team, look at getting some outside reviewers to take a look at this so that we can represent that it's indeed the best available science, and we had others taking a look and concurring in that, and then bringing this set of recommendations, whatever they may be. I'm really not in a position to even begin to speculate what those might look like, but we need to fully digest the reports before we're ready to put pen to paper and draft that out for your review and consideration. Okay. So it might be aggressive for us to do this by September, but maybe there's a check-in in September, and we'll see where we go from there.
All right. Does that sound good? That works. Okay. Thank you very much. Takes us to item 8 is the update from Michael George, the Delta Watermaster activities. Welcome.
Real quick before you start, I just wanted to say that I have to leave promptly at 7:30, so if I leave, it's not because of your presentation. So.
I deeply appreciate your mentioning that.
I got to leave as well, but not because of his reasoning.
And he's my ride, so I got to, no, I'm kidding.
Okay.
I'm kidding.
Look, I'll do this as fast as you want, guys. Thank you for having me here. I will try and move through some of this quickly. I do have some things to say about salinity and the problem that it presents in the Delta, so get into that. But I actually wanted to give you a quick update on some things going on with the State Water Board. And by the way, I would say, as you're giving the commission's point of view on salinity issues to the Stewardship Council, you shouldn't forget to share that with the State Water Board as well. I think some of the regulations that have come in for a little bit of criticism here could get back to the State Board and maybe improve some of the thinking about salinity going forward. I'm certainly working on that internally, and you've got a lot of expertise here, particularly in the South Delta, where the problem is becoming most acute. So anyway, a little update on the Water Board. Some good news about some progress that we've made on initiatives that we've been working on for a while in terms of getting a better handle on water rights and protecting seniority and dealing with challenges of measurement and so forth. And then I do want to spend some time with the bad news, which is the continuing and accelerating deterioration of the southern part of the Delta. So recent appointments to the State Board, I think you're aware that as of February we have a new chair, Joaquin Esquivel, and a new member, Laurel Firestone. So the board composition has changed a little bit under the Newsom administration. In addition, one of the big things that the State Board is working on is the Water Quality Control Plan. As of December, the Water Quality Control Plan for the southern, for the San Joaquin River and its tributaries was adopted by the board. But at that same time, there was a proposal for these voluntary settlements in lieu of the implementation of that Water Quality Control Plan. So the board left open space for that. In March, the voluntary, the negotiators of the voluntary settlements came back with a little bit more flesh on the bones, focused some additional questions, and the governor indicated that the affected state agencies should work together, that the state should come up with a proposal going forward, obviously with respect to the State Board having an independent responsibility for setting those water quality control standards. But the effort here is to align what's the progress that's being made in voluntary process with the water quality control planning process. And I would say that that voluntary settlement agreement process is one that we in the Delta really need to pay attention to, because if you notice what's happened so far is that well-organized tributaries up and down the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys have come forth with partial plans affecting their tributaries and their constituencies. But the Delta is still treated essentially as a black box, and it's essentially a black box about mass balance of water. In other words, additional water in, that's one of the points of the Water Quality Control Plan, a pretty universal understanding that there needs to be more flow in order to preserve the ecosystem benefits in the Delta. But in the Delta, it just comes in at Vernalis and at the 9th Street Bridge, and then it is only managed as a mass balance of how much water leaves the Delta. And I have been working hard to say, you got to get inside that black box and understands what's happening in the Delta, because otherwise we're going to have potentially more water, potentially a lot of habitat improvements, better food production, other things up outside the Delta, but a lot of that value could be dissipated if we don't pay attention to what's going on in the Delta. And overall, I'm hopeful about the voluntary settlement process because it has the potential to influence conditions in the watershed and in the Delta sooner than a water quality control plan, which has already got a dozen lawsuits against it and will take years to settle, so that it will defer for critical periods of time the kind of remediation that we might otherwise do. So that's what I have to say about what's going on within the State Water Board. I want to now focus on a number of areas where I think we are making good progress. And I'll go into each of these in a little detail, but again, if you want more detail about it, by all means, stop me, ask me, and we can get into it. So one of the most important things that came out of the multi-year drought was a recognition that our understanding of what was going on in terms of water rights was inadequate to manage in a time of shortage. So one of the things that we have been trying to do since that experience is to get a better handle on the data, to understand better what's going on, what the demands are, and so forth. And I will say that when I first came to this job, the sense was that there was either water use that was unlawful in the Delta, or that there was waste of water going on in the Delta. And I think what we've come to understand, what I've certainly come to understand, what the data supports, is that that's just not true. I do not believe, and I think the data supports the fact, that you cannot wring water out of the Delta and put it to some other use. Indeed, agriculture in the Delta is probably conserving water that would be, that ET, the loss of water from the system, would be higher if we weren't irrigating and cleaning fields and managing the water, and also managing its drainage from the Delta. So I think that's one important thing that is coming out of better data, better understanding of that data. One of the areas here is this, what we call a taxonomy of senior water rights. Remember, all the water rights in the Delta, most of them are outside the administrative jurisdiction of the state board. That is, they predated the establishment of the Water Commission in 1914. So we had very little information on that until the governor's emergency order gave the state board the authority to ask for the documentation that supports those water rights. Through going through all of that, and I'm very proud of the fact that we had 100% response to that request from the Delta. Extraordinary, and that's not true in the entire watershed, but within the Delta we had 100% response. So we've been going through that, trying to figure out what it tells us, what it indicates. We've published that data, and we've asked for crowd correction. If we've said something in here, if we've summarized your report to us incorrectly, tell us, help us correct it. And we've been, took us about 2.5 years to put that taxonomy out there. It's been about almost 2 years now, and it is a better and better data set because we've gotten this crowd correction. And every time we get somebody comes in and says, you got a little problem here, we say, okay, give us the data. We go through a process and we either correct it, maybe exactly the way it's suggested, maybe there's some change to it, or we set it for more research so that we can get to the bottom of it. But this is, again, trying to get into what's happening within the black box of the Delta. Where are the demands? How can they be managed, potentially choreographed? One of the things is if you're going to expend water for the purpose of giving fish cues to get smelt out or to draw spawners back, one of the things that can happen in the Delta is that we can avoid taking the top off of that pulse flow. So that's some of the uses for these data and allowing us to plan better for the next drought whenever it should come. In addition, this is a hard to read chart here, so I'm not going to ask you to do that except to tell you that what it shows is consistent year-over-year improvement in the quality of the data and in the compliance within the Delta. And these are, the compliance factors in the Delta are better than they are throughout the state or throughout the Delta watershed. we have gotten to 100% compliance with the reporting obligations. So that again is some really good news. And one of the things that's good about that is it allows us to move from the issue of just compliance. Did it get filed? We know now that it has been filed, and now we can look more at working with our partners in the Delta to get the quality of the data up and do more quality control and quality assurance. So that's where we're moving now, trying to improve the quality of the data that we've got. We have made it known that we review late submissions first, so we give a little incentive to get it in on time so that you don't get our scrutiny when it comes in late. We've also been able to spot consistent errors, and we've had a lot of help from the Delta water agencies and others to get those systemic errors corrected. We've published guidance about some of the areas where we think the data is weak, and we've had great help in terms of fixing that. And again, this is where the crowd correction comes in. We've been invited out to places in the Delta and go out, do field visits, explain our point of view, understand from the farmer, the water user's point of view, and helping to educate both ourselves and the water use community so that we get better information. One of the places that has really been the devil of a problem is the requirement that was put in as a trailer bill at the end of the drought. We didn't know it was the end of the drought at the time, but a trailer bill at the summer of 2015. We put in the requirement to measure every diversion in the Delta watershed. That has proven to be a very difficult requirement to actually implement. And some of the reasons on the slide that we've found that it really is difficult to bring that, what seems like a simple thing, measure every diversion. But it turns out that siphons are particularly difficult to measure, that the conditions in the Delta with tidal flows, with the kind of debris, invasive weeds, the hyacinth that clogs the pipes and the siphons and so forth. We've got constant maintenance issues and other things that have made implementing that regulation very difficult in the Delta. So what we've done is convene what we call the Delta Measurement Experimentation Consortium. And you got the logos of most of the people who are part of that consortium. And this includes, importantly, NGOs and agencies that were very supportive of the measurement regulation and who are now trying to help figure out how to deal with these challenges that we've had. Out of this experimentation process, where people share their successes, their failures, what they're running into, so that we avoid simply running out and putting a meter on everything that's destined to fail. We're actually sharing some of the experience that we've got through this consortium. And one of the things that has come out of that is my belief, and maybe call this a hypothesis at this point, is that we can do better than we anticipated doing with the measurement regulations. And the way we can do better is to use remote sensing as a way of coming to a very good estimate of crop water use in the Delta, because crop water use is the only thing that really is susceptible to management. You can't manage the evaporation of water from open channels. You can't manage the ET of riparian vegetation or floating invasive weeds. I mean, we found out in this process that hyacinth evapotranspires water at about 6 times the rate of open water. It's like a wick drawing water out of the freshwater channels and wicking it out into the atmosphere. So we can't manage those things any more than we are trying to do, but we can manage crop ET. And this is why I say, I think we're coming to the conclusion that there is no water to be saved in the Delta. There isn't water that's being wasted. And to the extent that you're diverting onto your crops more water than those crops need, you've got a concomitant responsibility of draining it. So if you overwater your crops, that water is going to return to the Delta very quickly. What that means to me is, because there is this quick return, because there is no storage in the Delta, what we could do is use the Delta as an experimentation for this remote sensing. And some of the land use data that you saw in Dr. Michael's presentation is from remote sensing. It's from taking these pictures from near space and interpreting them so that you can determine what's the crop, what's the level of development of the crop, et cetera. And what that means is that you can reduce the incidence of equipment failure, you can reduce the incidence of improper readings or lost data, all those kinds of things that make it very difficult to come up with good measurements in the Delta. So I'm hopeful that that process is going to lead to an alternative. The other thing that we are doing within the Office of the Delta Watermaster is coordinating with these initiatives from the Delta Stewardship Council. One is this Delta Science Funding and Government Implementation Plan. The Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee in April endorsed a white paper on the issue of Delta Science funding to try and figure out how to get that funding to be more consistent over time and to reach further than the kind of monitoring and mitigation science that's been done and is adequately funded primarily by the project contractors. What we're looking at here is, number one, taking the data, the rich data set sets that are available, and doing a better job of analyzing them and synthesizing them. So we take and move from data to actual information understanding. That's one area where we need to expand our scientific effort, and that we don't yet have funding for that. The second area is that look over the horizon. What is the Delta going to be like in the future? What are the challenges that we're going to face from climate change and other things? So as a result of the endorsement at the April meeting, there's now a working group trying to come up with an implementation plan. I'm chairing one of the 4 subgroups on that, and there'll be a report to the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee at their November meeting. The other thing, and this goes back to something again that Dr. Michaels mentioned about how do we determine what the vulnerability of the Delta is. We know there's going to be sea level rise. We know that'll have an impact on levees and salinity and probably lots of other things. So one of the things that the Delta Stewardship Council is doing is a Delta vulnerability assessment as phase 1, phase 2, what are the adaptation strategies? And all of this is designed to push all the interest in the Delta to this concept of one Delta, one science. Instead of combat science, as you were saying, Supervisor Natoli, you've got experts on both sides, and it's hard for policymakers to decide how to evaluate that kind of combat science. Dr. Desjardins also mentioned the credibility of science when it's paid for by one party versus another party. One of the ways to overcome that is to force the science together, get peer review at the initiation rather than at the back end. So we're working on that, and the the Water Board has actually authorized additional resources to go into that coordination with the Stewardship Council. So all that's the good news. Now the bad news, and here I can go really fast because nobody wants to hear this at the end of your meeting. But the Southern Delta is facing accelerating deterioration, and that has impacts obviously in our ability to attain the co-equal goals of reliable water supply and delta recovery. It reduces the value of all the ecosystem services that we need and get from the delta. Certainly it impedes fish migration, and because this is the southern part of the delta, this is really the issue for the San Joaquin River inflows and the development of habitat and so forth on the tributaries. One of the things that we are seeing very much in the southern part of the delta particularly, it's true all over, but with the uncertainty, instability, the unsustainability of the delta in its current form, it's very hard to create new capital investment in the delta. And one of the things that we're seeing now is that capital formation is either dependent upon the value of land that's been handed down and inherited rather than current value of land, or it's institutional money that is coming in to change a lot of the agricultural practices. And more than anything, this deterioration of the delta increases conflicts, and God knows we've got enough of those in the delta already. So the problem is that we are having these problems, loss of aquatic and terrestrial habitat, without any kind of resolution strategy or reconciliation strategy. There is no plan, there's no budget, there's no vision for fixing it. Now, when I say that, you might say, well, wait a minute, we've got this Eco Restore project, which we do, and it's proceeding much more rapidly now than it had been. We've also got this Central Delta Corridor project where we're kind of stringing together publicly owned lands to try and do ecosystem remediation on them. But what they have in common is that there's nothing going on in the southern delta. There's no part of either of those plans that is focused on the area that is so rapidly deteriorating. So one of the things that's happening as a result is that sediment is choking up the channels in the southern delta. It used to be that we had this concept that every once in a while there'd be a flood, we'd get a gully washer, and it would restore delta channel capacity. That's not true anymore. We had gully washers in 2017, we had them again this last year. But what's happening in the delta, in the southern part of the delta, is different than what used to happen. That is, there are no gullies to be washed out anymore. What happens is you pour down, say, 15,000 CFS, pretty high flows, coming into the delta at Vernalis. It gets to the head of Old River, splits in two. It goes a few miles down Old River, it splits in two again onto Middle River, and then just a bit beyond that, you get to Doherty Cut, and 60% of the water goes off into Doherty Cut and right down Grant Line Canal. What you're left with is important sections of Middle and Old River that cannot be washed out. You get these fast flows that bring sediment, and then it all slows down in these tendrils in the southern part of the delta, and you've got sediment buildup with all these problems here: water temperature, algae blooms, concentration of the nasties, reduction of the net flows, reduction in dissolved oxygen, uptick in invasive species, much less ability to manage the flood risk. So one of the things that has happened as a result of this, that is the continuing deterioration, an ad hoc group has come together. We're part of it. We didn't convene it. We're part of it to try and figure out what to do about this problem. And of course, one of the things we figured out early in the process is one of the reasons for this sediment buildup is the difficulty regulatorily to get dredging permits to deal with the problem. It's particularly difficult for individual farmers. The mobilization costs, the regulatory permitting costs are just prohibitive. So the idea of this ad hoc group is to say, let's look at all the problems, let's look at how they affect all the different communities. It's not just exporters, it's not just farmers, it's not just environmentalists, it's not just issues of, say, methylmercury or other specific constituents. It's all of that. Can we get our arms around it and figure out a solution that involves a way of dealing with the Southern Delta as a system rather than as a problem for individual farmers, let's say, on Middle River, where the water level, which is what we try to manage for, is right where it should be. The problem is you haven't got the depth of channel anymore. So instead of having at this level of concern where we used to have, say, 8 feet of freeboard where you could draw water out and use it for your crops, now it's maybe only 2 feet, and you can't operate your pump because you get down to sucking sand very quickly. So what we're looking at is solving the problem on a broader basis and recognizing with the NGOs who have environmental concerns and Region 5 water quality and the export interests and the farming interests, that it's a common problem that we've got to figure out a way to get routine dredging operating again so that we have channels that can actually move water and provide the ecosystem services that they used to provide, because the alternative is continued rapid deterioration of the Southern Delta, and we will get to a point where it will not be salvageable. We'll have enough weeds and algae blooms and warm water and low oxygen that we'll have a disaster on our hands. I told you there's some bad news here. The other thing, and this goes to earlier discussions, salinity hotspots. The Southern Delta is a patchwork of hotspot problems because from a regulatory standpoint, we at the state board tend to think of the Delta, as I said, a black box, but essentially a riverine system. You put water in at Vernalis and at the 9th Street Bridge and on the McCollum and so forth, and you run it through the Delta and it goes out and carries fish and brings fish back. But what the Delta really is much more, as you all know, is it's a tidally dominated system with some river influences. So the amount of impact that you can have in a tidal system with modest river influences is somewhat limited. And take, for instance, that problematic stretch of Old River from Doherty Cut, let's say, over to the inlet to the federal pumps. There's not much river flow there. It's primarily water sloshing back and forth on the tides twice a day. And of course, because of where the export pumps are, you're taking the top off of the incoming tide, and you're reducing that tidal energy when that's all there really is moving back and forth in there. So it is salinity is a problem, and salinity is a problem for farmers, as we're all acutely aware. And the issue of how we deal with this is right before the state board right now. And that's why I say, if you're going to have something to say about salinity and about these studies, don't forget to share that with the State Water Board. Because as a result of all of this stuff, the problem is the Southern Delta remains the killing fields for fish and for endangered species particularly. And unless we deal with it, we're going to find that we're going to continue to just lose the fish that we're trying to get into, through, and back into the delta because the conditions are so bad. It's not just predators like this picture, it's all those other aspects that I described. And then the issue of farmers migrating to higher value, mechanized crops. And that's happening in the Delta as it's happening throughout California. A lot of it is, as you say, Skip, regulatorily driven. It's the expense and the difficulty of getting agricultural workers. Think about asparagus. You got to have somebody who knows what he or she is doing, cutting every stalk of asparagus. We're not really competitive anymore because of the availability of agricultural labor. So we're moving to this. Now, one of the things about the picture here is when you see this in your remote imaging, you know the day that orchard got planted, and you know from the image and reading the image that it's almonds. You can now project the use of water over 30 years because it's not much now. Those are just twigs in the ground, but they're growing to be trees. It's got a 30-year life. You can start to make projections that are pretty reliable about water use, nutrient use, electrical demand for draining these areas, to keep the root zone fresh. So this is a phenomenon that's being driven by rational farmers making rational decisions about where the markets are, about what they can afford to do and how they can be profitable. And that's one thing I try and say as many times as I get an audience. Agriculture and the management of agricultural lands is the only strategy for managing our highly engineered land mass in the Delta. There is no plan B. We've got to keep agriculture sustainable and profitable, because if we don't, the deterioration in the Delta will continue, the water use in the Delta will rise, and the ecosystem services will go down. Caveat to that is the terrestrial habitat that you're seeing there is not nearly as high quality as the terrestrial habitat that was taken out from the other crops that were there. As we move to nuts and grapes, we're reducing the value for critters of that terrestrial habitat. So these are tough questions that we are grappling with, that all of us have to figure out, because then we got the elephant in the waiting room here, climate change, and what impacts that's going to have on us as we go forward. So that's my report right now, and I appreciate your attention and look forward to coming back and telling you hopefully more good news next time than bad news.
Perfect. Thank you very much. As always, thank you, George, for coming out, and always very informative. Are there any questions or comments from the Commission?
Just a quick comment. I appreciated your insight in regards to the flows, various tributaries, certainly levees, et cetera. We had the atmospheric rivers in 17, property owners, including farmers and others, who had sandbars as high as the top of their canals or levees, were deathly afraid of doing anything for fear of being thrown in jail or fined, et cetera. Even with the county taking emergency measures, which gave us more authority, we had to actually send a county employee out to tell them exactly what they could do, because they were deathly afraid that if they did anything wrong, they would end up with some kind of citation, et cetera. A reason I bring this up is because individuals like yourself, and certainly, the number of places that you share your insights is important, because we really need to, and nobody likes to hear the word dredge, but clean up is the reality of it. And we really need to do that on all fronts, as opposed to just, in your particular position or our positions. But that is a global problem, certainly in the Delta.
So if I can just say, I think the Army Corps of Engineers, which is the primary regulator of dredging, and now with the new state dredge and fill regulations, there is a recognition that we need to have dredging. We need to manage and maintain viable channels in our rivers and certainly in the southern part of the Delta. So there's a willingness to work on this in a way that I think there hadn't been in the past. That said, there are nationwide permits that if you fit within the conditions, you can get the permit relatively cheaply, relatively quickly. The problem is that's not accessible to an individual farmer. You need to have some larger entity, some larger group with expertise. I'm reminded of sitting at a meeting recently, and I had two farmers on each side. On the one side was a scientist from Gallo who was talking about all these regulatory processes that she works through. It's her full-time job. And on my left side was a farmer who had 40 acres of almonds, and that was her business. Well, she clearly doesn't have the capability of dealing with all the regulations the way that Gallo can do it professionally, efficiently over a much broader economy of scale. So we've got a similar situation with respect to dredging. We need to have a larger group working together over a larger period of time. And one of the things that's good about this, it's a little bit of group therapy, because the farmers in the southern Delta, George, you know this, love to point at the projects as the problem and as the deep pockets to fix the problem. And the projects love to say, well, you farmers don't keep you don't do your maintenance. This is a circumstance where instead of pointing fingers at each other, the two groups come together and can actually work together to get something positive for both of them. So I think a little of that group therapy is probably a good thing.
All right, well, thank you. Skip.
To the point about working with government, we in Solano County have the Solano County Water Agency, and we have a small grants program for minor flooding projects. But the problem is the individual trying to get through the bureaucracy is almost impossible. So what we're doing is we're going to set up where the water agency will be the point for trying to deal with those sorts of permitting agencies, and that way the individual steps back, agency steps in. Hopefully that will, and I think that's what you're getting at.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all over. All right. Any other comments or questions? Thank you, thank you very much, Ms. George, for coming out, as always. All right, that takes us to item 9. It's an update on the Delta Socioeconomic Indicators project.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners, for allowing me to present for a few minutes on the Socioeconomic Indicators report. You all got this report in your packet. So this is the first thing. This report idea came from a staff recommendation that was actually based on the 2012 ESP to develop some economic sustainability scorecard to track progress and trends in the Delta. And so the Delta Protection Commission initiated this contract in 2016, and the researchers convened some groups to talk about what kinds of indicators were available. They did talk to the Commission in November of that year about what the indicators may look like. And at the January 2018 meeting, Dr. Catherine Brinkley was here and presented on the draft report. So that's the first part of it. And then the second part is outside on the table and also in front of you is this infographics. So commission staff, along with a graphic artist, pulled out some of the socioeconomic indicators that the findings that the researchers had, but we wanted to present this in a pictorial fashion. to convey a lot of information in a very easily understandable format. So the middle portion of this is just background data so that people have a sense of what the delta looks like, and then on either side is the socioeconomic indicator information. A couple things to point out, population-wise, so this was from 2015, but the secondary zone had 573,000 people living there, and there's 9,400 people in the primary zone. Median household income, the secondary zone was pretty close to the state of California average, and the primary zone was less, but that would be anticipated in an agricultural economy. Recreation, we found that the hunting licenses was pretty interesting. So you have about 1.5% of the population of California buying, or those zip codes, it wasn't necessarily the people in there, but in those zip codes, almost 20% of the hunting and fishing licenses for the state were sold. So understandably, there's a lot of hunting and fishing. That's a huge part of the Delta heritage and recreation economy. Housing and roads, we have road pavement condition. There's a lot of discussion at these meetings about traffic. Caltrans does an assessment of the state highways, and actually 63% of those roads were found in good condition. So depends on where you drive, I suppose. And then the last point to point out is the high school graduation rates were really, sorry?
I was going to ask you a question about the roads, though.
Yes.
You just draw the Caltrans data. You know, many of the roads in the Delta are locally maintained, either the counties and or the cities. And I guess I'm curious as to how, if you're going to have an accurate portrayal of, you know, road conditions, you know, if you're going to get off the beaten track at all, you're probably going to get on a local road versus a state highway. And, you know, that's been part of the consideration this commission has weighed in on in the past, as you're probably well aware, is that, you know, where does Caltrans, beyond maintaining the road pavement, contributions for protections that come from levees, as well as other infrastructure that relies on those levees, at least in part, for protection of their infrastructure. But I guess I'm curious, is there not a way, as a part of this, to get the local road picture? Because that's far more likely that you're going to drive on, you know, I would say that, you know, particularly if you're looking for some of the things that are referenced here, if you're going to go hunting or fishing, if you're going to go to a winery, if you're going to go to a marina, in large part, you're not going to get it off of one of the state highways. You're going to get there potentially from somewhere else into the Delta, but then you're going to get onto a local road. So I guess I'm just curious about how that gets portrayed.
I think that's something that we could talk about for the next iteration of this, to develop more data. So this data was all publicly available. Most of it is from multiple sources, and it's so Caltrans does that on a regular basis, on an annual basis. They look at all of their roads. So I guess the next step would be reaching out to the counties and then seeing how the counties do that. So Caltrans has a very specific, and you can find it in the report if you want more information, is they have a really specific coding, red, yellow, or green, you know, state 1, 2, or 3, and so they categorize all of their roads. So that data was easy to pull together into this indicator. But I mean, if the county transportation departments were keeping track of those sorts of data, I think that would be great to pull in, because there are a lot of...
And let me just make a point here, because, and I know I've spoken to it at the Conservancy, and certainly I'm well aware of it, as my colleagues are, you know, county supervisors, that, you know, there are many lane miles of roads in the Delta, and, you know, a lot of them may not be as high volume, although to your point, and we all hear it about traffic, and yet, you know, if it's portrayed that, you know, there's, you know, that, you know, 80% of the roads are in fair to better shape, you know, I mean, you speak to Caltrans' availability and viability of funds, but we also maintain bridges, you know, in cooperation with counties oftentimes, and those have expense for maintenance. Some of that dollars come down from other sources. But, you know, if you look at this, you say, well, 80% of the roads are in pretty good shape. I can tell you what I hear from my constituency is, and I'm well aware of it, I drive the roads too, that, you know, that's not the case on the local roads, and we are oftentimes starved, or we have to compete for those dollars in suburban and other areas because the way the dollars flow to counties and or cities. And so I guess again, this is, you know, a snapshot, and it's very good, so this is not being critical. I just think, though, when we go to make comments about, you know, the infrastructure that links us, particularly mobility as it relates to surface transportation, on the land side anyway, it's key that, you know, Caltrans may boast about how good their roads are, but I can tell you that, you know, it doesn't take very, you know, get 4 feet off the state highway and you can be into a road that's, you know, and we are challenged, at least I know in our county, I'll speak for myself. In our county, we're spending on 3 roads in the Delta this season. One's under reconstruction, you know, this week. I'm going to spend $1.5 million of the $3 million I get for the district, and I go from Ranch Cordova to the Antioch Bridge, just to take on Jackson Terminus and Sherman Island Crossroad, and we're not doing those roads fully. And so it's a major investment. It's important. Those are linkages to our communities. It reflects a lot of what's in this data, and I guess I just wanted to make that point. I know it's late, Mr. Chair, so I wanted to call that out.
And I think that actually speaks to audience too, where it's what the difference, who our outreach will be to, and who can use this information to advocate for what they need in their communities. So that's one of the reasons why we put it together. And then my last point was the high school graduation rates from Rivers Delta School District is actually higher than what the state of California. I think that's a good nod to that school district. Just a really quick point about where this report is going and when we may redo it, or not redo it, but add to this information. So the American Community Survey, which a lot of this data is based on, will be aggregating their next set of 5-year data next year. So it's usually the year after that data is collected. And then the census data would be available in 2021. And so we'd probably look to that time frame in order to repeat this and develop our trend data.
I'm glad you brought that up because I'm chair of our census count committee, and I've thought a lot about how the fact we really do want to emphasize Delta as a place, and are we getting people counted, and there's a lot of intimidation and fear related to that, and I think it'd be great if we could you know, do some sort of type of communication to encourage everybody to be counted and want everybody to be counted. And that was one of my questions related to the sources of the data. And on Don's comment about the roads, today technology will divert you onto different roads. And so those roads that are in great condition aren't necessarily the ones that these other apps are going to send us on. And so it would be good to make sure that we are reflecting the conditions of our roads properly.
Chair, just want to comment, in relation to the American City Survey, we had a not so positive experience with that in the last round of the census. In fact, for 4 decades, the Sacramento County portion of Delta was included in the Community Development Block Grant Program. We got exited from the program because they used the American City Survey, which didn't reach deep enough into those communities. We had to go out. We spent 3 years working with our Housing Redevelopment Agency and with the communities to go back out and to do almost on a person-by-person basis a census count that then reflected an accurate, which had been portrayed in previous census accounts. And I think part of the fallacy we found is that they mail to folks oftentimes that have a physical address versus a P.O. box. It doesn't come out, you know, may this time come out in different languages. I guess it goes to what Diane said a moment ago about, you know, people's fear about what it means to respond to the census, and that's been highlighted obviously in recent discussions throughout this nation. But I'll tell you, it costs us a bunch of money and a time, but we're now back in the block grant program, but they're going to use American City Survey again, and so it's important to Delta. Those dollars come to help our local fire departments, to help roads, libraries, schools, and we were basically exited out of the program for a 4-year period and couldn't put that money to good use in our communities because we weren't eligible. And it was a fallacy. It was not true. And so I just make that point.
And one of the undercounted populations is residents where they're not supposed to be. And so if you've got farmland where you've got a lot of people living, say, in trailers, there's a fear that if you are counted, that it's going to come back on you through local government, and that, in fact, isn't true. They're not allowed to share that. And so, again, I think that it would behoove us to participate in that outreach because these numbers do matter in grants and in representation, and we do want to count everybody.
Any other questions, comments on the report? Well, first of all, thank you for, I know you sped things up very quickly because you
Yes, I
recognized
sure
the
did.
hour, so thank you for that. But there's a tremendous amount of work that's gone in here. There's a lot of good material. Personally, I love the graphic. I think that's a great sort of a snapshot, easy display of kind of what's happening because it's critically important. But as you heard, there's nuances to how the data is represented. So, all right. Yep.
I would just add, I mean, I think if you haven't used it in social media on all the new accounts, that would be awesome to incorporate those images.
So this is hot off the press. You're all the first to see it. There's extra copies out there, but we are doing a communication plan and social media as part of that. So,
And the thing about these infographics is that there's studies that I've seen that these things will have people read these reports longer. They will dig in deeper when something triggers it. So this is not just, it's not dumbing it down. It's just engaging people and getting them more interested to become better informed. So it's really helpful.
Thank you.
That's a great, I didn't know that, but that's what happens to me, so I'm glad to know that that's what happened. Okay, that's helpful.
No, and if I could add something to that, Mr. Chair, I was certainly real pleased with this product. It's a little bit new for us. You know, we're a government agency. We don't often think of the stuff that's right in front of us all the time, but it certainly is getting us thinking about how we can present other information in such a manner. But I was very complimentary of the team that pulled this together, which included Melinda, Stacy, and another graphic assistant we had.
Thank you, Melinda. Very good. Very good. All right. So item 11 is commissioner comments or announcements. Are there any comments or other announcements by any of the commissioners? Without seeing any, that takes us to the end of our meeting, so we're adjourned.